Chapter 6, A Time of Violence. Okay, the big question in this chapter is what sequence of events caused people to storm the Bastille and why did the unrest spread? So we're going to find out what the Bastille was, why they stormed it or attacked it, and why there was so much unrest or chaos going on in France. The stage is set for violence. King Louis XVI was angry that the new National Assembly refused to disband, and he was nervous, so nervous that he no longer trusted his own French troops. He had his Swiss guards brought from France's borders to the outskirts of Paris to protect him. The people of Paris and the deputies of the National Assembly were alarmed. Rumors started to fly. What was the king planning to do with these troops? Would he arrest the deputies of the Third Estate just when they thought they might make some changes, maybe get a little freedom and relief from the overwhelming tax burdens? Okay, remember in the last chapter in the video that you watched, the National Assembly was formed basically with that Third Estate. So they thought they were going to be able to change some things. And now with the king bringing in extra troops, they're nervous. Was the king going to stop them now? On July 8th, one of the strongest leaders of the new assembly spoke out angrily. He said that all these troops arriving in Paris every day were preparations for war. The members of the assembly should not sit quietly and watch this happen, he argued. Okay, so in this section, I think it's important to know that the king had these extra troops brought in for protection, and that the people saw that as the king preparing for a war. And they were very nervous about that. Okay, so here again, it's just showing the Swiss guards were employed by European royal courts when needed. So King Louis XVI felt that they were needed here. In Paris, the working class, the sans-culottes, grew more alarmed and angry. Because of the failing economy, 150,000 Parisians out of a population of 600,000 were out of work. Bread had been in short supply for several months, and prices had risen so high that a single loaf cost as much as a half-day's pay. Because of these outrageous prices, many people went hungry. Working people were convinced that the aristocrats and grain suppliers were withholding grain to force the price of bread even higher. Okay, so some of the problems happening here. We had a failing economy. We had people that were out of work. Prices of bread had gone up. So food cost was getting too high. And so basically the people of Paris, people of France were hungry. Then on July 12th, the king made another mistake, a big one. He fired his finance minister, Jacques Necker, who had encouraged Louis to give in to the Third Estate's demands. Now the king had gotten rid of Necker and was organizing his troops. People thought that the king, under the influence of the queen and the nobles at court, would use force to disband the National Assembly and take back all that they had gained. With such rumors flying around, it's no wonder that angry mobs roamed the streets, breaking into shops, looting and grabbing weapons, threatening the homes of the wealthy, and stealing bread from the bakeries. The stage was set for the first and most famous outbreak of violence in the French Revolution. Okay, so it's important to know here that the people of Paris believed that Necker was their ally, their friend. They believed that he was the one that was going to help save them and work with them. So when the king fired Necker, that upset the people. To the Bastille. The Bastille was an old fortress from the 1300s, with stone walls 5 feet thick and 8 stone towers. A moat surrounded the outer wall, a drawbridge led to the entrance. An inner court was protected by a second moat and a drawbridge. The Bastille was the object of legend and mystery to most Parisians. It was rumored that men were chained in secret dungeons. Actually, the Bastille held only 7 prisoners on July 14, 1789. There were even plans to have the prison demolished. But to Parisians, it represented the tyranny of the Bourbon kings. Okay, a couple things important here. That even though it was somewhat of a prison, the Bastille did not have very many prisoners on this day. And the Parisians, or the people of Paris, looked at the Bastille as something very negative. They looked at it as an example of the tyranny, the rulership of those kings that they had had for so many years, King Louis XIV, XV, and XVI. Bernard de Launay, governor of the Bastille, was, according to one of his officers, without much knowledge of military affairs, without experience, and without much courage. On the morning of July 14th, the sky was heavy with dark rain clouds. Launay walked the Bastille's ramparts, the tops of the high walls, thinking about the reports he had heard of riots throughout the city overnight. The Bastille was manned with 82 elderly soldiers, plus 32 Swiss guards. Stockpiled inside were 250 barrels of gunpowder that had been moved to the Bastille for safekeeping. There were numerous cannons and smaller guns. The drawbridges were pulled closed. Launay was ready for trouble, or so he thought. Okay, a couple things here. There were soldiers and guards. Inside, besides being the very few prisoners, we had gunpowder, so ammunition there, and then some cannons and smaller guns, so some weapons and ammunition. That morning, the rioters had broken into the storage facility where the army's weapons were kept. The crowd took 30,000 muskets and carried off the cannons stored there. But they had no gunpowder and only a few bullets. Then the rioters learned that the gunpowder had been moved to the Bastille. The shout went up, "To the Bastille! To the Bastille!" From his window in the Bastille, Launay could hear the noisy mob approaching. Okay, so again, the rioters had guns but no gunpowder, and they learned that the gunpowder was stored in the Bastille. When the rioters arrived at the Bastille, they saw walls bristling with cannons. They were convinced that the cannons were going to be used to attack the city, not simply to defend the Bastille. An official delegation went to Launay to ask him to remove the cannons from the walls and to hand over the fortress to a group of citizen soldiers. Launay agreed to remove the cannons, but he refused to surrender the Bastille. Okay, so he did not surrender. As news of the crisis spread, more and more sans-culottes joined the crowd outside the Bastille. Several men broke the pulleys holding the drawbridges, and the crowd surged into the courtyard, where there was a second set of drawbridges. Shots rang out from the crowd and from the soldiers on the ramparts. The crowd shouted, "Down with the bridges!" Eventually realizing that resistance was useless, Launay opened the gates. Crowds of armed men immediately surged into the prison, taking the soldiers and Swiss guards captive and freeing the 7 prisoners. Okay, so they took the soldiers and the guards captive, freed the prisoners. Launay was taken prisoner, but his guards could not protect him from the angry mob. Before he could reach safety, Launay was brutally killed, along with another defender. Many people were horrified at the savagery of the mob. but to many the fall of the Bastille was the true beginning of the revolution. All right, so initially they took Launay, who was in charge of the Bastille, as a prisoner, but it's also important to know they didn't just take him as a prisoner, that the mob did eventually kill him. The morning after the fall of the Bastille, King Louis was awakened early with the news. "Is this a rebellion?" he asked the official who had brought him the news. "No, sire, this is a revolution," was now the famous reply. Strangely, the king wrote the following journal entry for the day: "Rain," meaning nothing. The Great Fear. Necker, the finance minister, whose firing had triggered the riots, was returned to office 2 days later. Okay, so that was a king's mistake that he must have fixed. But rioting and violence continued. In Paris, 2 of the king's officials were attacked and killed by a mob in a particularly gruesome manner. The violence spread throughout the countryside. A poor harvest in 1788 had caused a shortage of grain. Bread was in short supply in the countryside as well as in the cities. Peasants attacked millers who were accused of hoarding grain. They destroyed fences and walls on the estates, killing animals in the private forests of the nobility. They broke into the manors where nobles lived. Sometimes they killed the manor lord and his family. Some nobles decided to flee France and settle in other countries. They were called émigrés. As the violence continued, a period of confusion and panic, known as the Great Fear, swept the countryside. Wild rumors spread that bands of violent ruffians, British troops or Spanish troops, in the pay of the nobility, were roaming the countryside, burning crops and murdering peasants. In a panic, peasants armed themselves with whatever they could find: knives, pitchforks, hoes. They hid in the forest or in caves. When the murdering gangs failed to materialize, the fear passed as quickly as it appeared. But the people continued rioting, so things did not settle down. In villages, the king's officials abandoned their offices. They were replaced with middle-class mayors and officials friendly to the revolution. Central authority was breaking down. The militia did not help because most of its members sympathized with the rioters. In Versailles, the National Assembly was in session, working on reforms and a constitution. News of the summer's riots and looting alarmed the deputies. A duke who was one of the richest nobles of the land spoke to the assembly. In several provinces, the whole people form a kind of league for the destruction of the manor houses, the ravaging of the lands, and especially for the seizure of the archives where the title deeds to feudal properties are kept. It seeks to throw off, at last, a yoke that has, for many centuries, weighted it down. The question that faced the National Assembly now was what to do about the violence. Okay, so lots of vocabulary words here. We have province, which would be an area, kind of like what we would consider a state. We have an archive where official documents were kept. A title deed is something that shows that somebody owns something. It shows ownership. And the yoke is a harness, usually used with animals, but we can also think of it here as just something that was holding the people back. And so it says that they're finally going to throw off that yoke, whatever's been holding them back. All right, so now it's the job of the National Assembly to come up and create some sort of reform, constitution, and also how to stop the violence. Okay, you are ready to take your quiz. Go ahead and do that. It's a short quiz with only, I think, maybe 5 questions, and then get that submitted. Have a great day.